A couple years ago, I made a video about On the Silver Globe, a crazy theological and philosophical space opera from Polish director Andrzej Zulawski. I like that movie a lot, but I have to admit, it has one small flaw, which is that it's impossible to understand what's happening, and it is torturous to watch. I guess that's two small flaws. If you watch that movie, you're going to lose your mind. I guess that's three minor issues. Since that video came out, a few people have asked me about Zulawski's more famous movie. His most famous film, his only English language film, Possession. And admittedly, I was kind of hesitant to watch it because of this whole losing your mind thing. But that was a big mistake on my part because I absolutely love Possession and I have a lot to say about it. Now, if, like me, you've just come in from On the Silver Globe, you might find Possession to actually be quite pleasant, relaxed, coherent, very reasonable movie. If you haven't seen that film, then buckle your seatbelt because Possession is a bit unhinged. First things first, I've seen a lot of people make sense of this movie in different ways. There's a lot of different things to think about. There's a lot of different stuff going on in Possession. Maybe it's a cult film, for instance, to be marveled at mainly because of its extremes and its idiosyncrasies. It certainly has some of those, right? But maybe it's an art film whose theological moments we should meditate on. Should we be taking notes when we watch this movie? Should we be trying to piece together the film's tantalizing details like some kind of a detective? There's the pink socks. There's the time spent in the bathtub. There's a few spiral staircases, lots of doorways. What could it mean? There are also some conspicuous, more structural elements like the doubled characters, the demarcation, the divisions. Of course, maybe it's all a big Soviet allegory. Or maybe it's a movie about a woman that uncovers some unsupported desire, some sort of othering, or a consequence of immobility, a monstrous consequence of social restriction. I'm not sure Zulawski would be the expert on that, but maybe this resonates with some viewers. I don't know. Of course, maybe we should just start by trying to understand what actually happens in the movie. Should I title this video Possession Explained and just explain the plot to you? I won't be doing that. Maybe we should see this as a personal movie, an autobiography with some extreme metaphors in it, the story of Zulawski's recent breakup. This is sort of a humanist film, centering around marital problems. You know, this is a horror movie, but some of the most horrifying and visceral moments have nothing supernatural or occult in them. They're the scenes of domestic violence. That said, you'd probably be a bit foolish to call this a realistic film. Maybe we should just spend all our time trying to decide what kind of movie it is. Everyone who talks about Possession is going to start by saying it's genre defining, right? I just said the same thing. I don't think there's much insight here, but it's worth noting that there's a lot of different levels to embrace this movie on, and it might not be obvious where to go, especially when you first watch it. I'm going to engage with some of these things. Others I don't think are totally worth our time. This movie is famous enough and infamous enough to attract quite a bit of criticism. There's plenty of video essays about this movie. There's a book about this movie, which is okay. Possession might not be famous enough for any of the critique out there to be really top level, but people have thought about this movie, and I thought, hey, I might as well add my opinion to the pile. Why not? For once, I actually finished up this movie with something concise to say in this video. Concise. Would you believe that? I think I have a real thesis about Possession, a claim as to what it's really about or how to think about it, and how it actually fits it right in with On the Silver Globe. We'll come to that in a little bit. I'm not going to talk too much about the people involved with the movie. You can go look it up. Like I said, there's information about this movie. I've been a big fan of Sam Neill ever since I saw him in The Water Cycle, a true cult film. I love the movie Until the End of the World. I would love to cover that on the channel one of these days, but it's so long. One of my all-time favorite movies, and of course he's great in that pretty interesting career. This movie is an international affair. We have the Kiwis, the Germans, the French, the Poles, some American money, and where did Zulawski want to shoot the movie? Well, how about as close to the Soviet Union as possible, please? We'll come to that in a bit. I have a few more uninsightful things to say before we get to the interesting stuff. First, talk about the style a bit. I was pleased to see that this movie has some of the same stylistic cues, some of the same elements as On the Silver Globe. It's not as extreme, but we have a similar desaturated look at times. Lots of handheld shooting as well. Thankfully, it's not as manic. They stabilize the camera for the most part in this movie. The style of this film, I think, is great. It's one of the highlights, obviously. You kind of don't need me to tell you about it. There's some extremely beautiful moments, but also a lot of unsettling things. One thing that struck me was how empty a lot of the shots look. Even one of the first scenes where Anna and Mark, that's the two main characters, they're out on the street, right? Pretty simple scene. Feels kind of weird. I think the camera's pulled back maybe just a little more than usual here. This is more noticeable in other scenes, the sort of emptiness. Like Mark goes for an interview a bit later in a really large room where only the corner of it is being used. And the camera, we're not doing a reverse shot thing. The camera is like orbiting around him in an interesting way. Reminds me a little bit of what I discussed some in my video about Contempt. The apartment that they live in is filmed kind of in a similar way. It's sort of a barren location to start with, although before long they'll have strewn most of their possessions across the floor. But the camera also seems a little bit pulled back into the corner of the room. There's some interesting shots of Mark and Anna in bed where we're looking like straight down at them. These are all really typical shots to see in a movie, but Zulawski finds a way to make it look kind of weird. These are not the most noticeable stylistic things. Other people are probably going to talk about other things first. But like I said, this movie has a pretty interesting tone. Even in some of the more pedestrian shots, even some of the more straightforward shots are not exactly what you would expect. As the movie goes on, the camera work gets more and more dynamic. You could maybe get somewhere with a close reading of all of this, but I think that's enough for now. Some people make a lot of the divisions in this film. There's a lot of demarcations in the movie, whether that's a therapist's office that's mainly filled with doorways or the Berlin Wall, which opens the film. I think there's a lot more to this movie than separation, but like I said, it starts with the Berlin Wall, so there's something there, maybe. It's interesting how much of the movie is set in domestic spaces. A lot of it takes place in different apartments. You could read a lot into how these places are laid out and furnished. There's an old apartment, for instance, and a new apartment, and then a really new apartment. Does this have something to do with history and modernity? Probably. I'm not going to go too far down that path. Obviously, this is a domestic story to some extent, and if it is somehow speaking to communist life, well, that was in some ways a domestic altercation, so maybe it makes sense. This movie has really zoomed in on quotidian things in the early stages, the little routines, how they might change. I like the music in this film and the lack of music as well. Some horror movies really rely on music, and you would almost expect this movie to have a really brash score, like the one that Goblin made for Suspiria. Great movie. But the old one, I mean, the new one's decent, I guess. Anyway, but a lot of the scenes in this movie, they kind of stand on their own without much music, and the sound comes in as punctuation at the right times. I like the balance of the 80s synth stuff with something more classical sounding. Maybe I shouldn't say this because it's kind of impossible to unhear it, but the main piano theme is fairly similar to some of Nino Rota's music for The Godfather. Don't tell anyone, though. Anyway, let's get to the interesting stuff. Let's talk about reality a little bit. Some people root this movie in Zulawski's life. Apparently, he had just gone through a divorce before making Possession. Well, that can't be a coincidence that this movie is kind of about divorce. It probably isn't. Of course, Zulawski also would have been going through the altercation around On the Silver Globe, the production of which was halted for quite a while. That would have happened a few years before this movie was made. He was sort of shepherded out of Poland, I think. So there's plenty of trauma in his personal life, and there's plenty of trauma in this movie, but I think it's a mistake to draw the line too clearly between those two. One view of this movie is that it's just a really extreme breakup movie, right? Where a bunch of metaphors are used to tell us how Zulawski felt. I don't really buy this. For one thing, what a lot of messing around just to express something that almost everybody knows something about already, right? But having seen some of Zulawski's other work, I just think that surely he had more on his mind than his own life. I think that's the starting point. Maybe, for instance, he's trying to use this more common feeling of relationships falling apart, heartbreak, contempt, to talk about something bigger, to talk about something else. So maybe it's the starting point, but let's not finish the conversation there. Anyway, most horror movies try to delay and delay and delay. That's one of the tenets of suspense, I guess. They try to delay as much as possible before they let you know what is really going on. Oh, it's nothing supernatural. That was just the wind, right? Of course, if you're watching any famous movie, you probably already know more or less what the gambit is. The title of this movie, Possession, might give you a pretty strong hint about what could happen. But the film plays its cards remarkably close to its chest. Like I mentioned, it starts with domestic discords. And at first, the disagreements seem kind of plausible, but they get more and more extreme. And here, I think the audience is searching for the boundary of reality a little bit, wondering, is this normal? Is this what couples do? Or is something different happening here? Something strange happening here? Is someone possessed? At first, it's not even clear who that might be, which is interesting. It takes about 45 minutes before the movie shows you what's really happening. And I have to commend the movie for being unpredictable and engaging throughout. But I bring all this up for a different reason, which is to come back to this question of reality. Is this movie about reality? Is it about Zulawski? I think this search for the boundary of rational thought and the beginning of mania, hysteria, and something even beyond that, something of the occult, the collapse of reality, I think that's a really significant part of the movie. It actually reminds me of On the Silver Globe somewhat, this descent into mania. Where does it start? What's the essence of that, right? I think this is a crucial part of this movie, searching for this boundary, and I think we should not relegate that to a structure of autobiographical reality and metaphor. Just, oh, hey, here's what a breakup is like. It's almost like if there were some monster, right? Don't think so. Let me be a bit reductive for a second. If you think that all of the spooky stuff uncovered in this movie is in the heads of the characters, then these characters are insane, right? And they're cruel to each other. They have no emotional intelligence. And this kind of becomes yet another movie about a woman's hysteria. I don't find that particularly compelling. It's also, by the way, really privileges Mark's view if you think of this too autobiographically. Anyway, so what else is going on? Is it really just that these two characters don't like each other that much anymore, and as such have decided to torture each other? Or is there's some other psychic driving factor? There's something else going on here. These are symptoms of something, maybe, right? I know people can be mean to each other in breakups and divorces, but again, I think this movie is playing with the boundary of rational thought, and more so, the boundary of reality, right? And that's pretty important. We get very little background in this movie, so we don't really know why the couple, is at odds. You think, well, maybe Anna is right to be disenchanted with Mark. He's out of town a lot, right? He's some kind of international super spy after all. Okay, there's some tantrums, sure, but people have tantrums in real life. People have breakdowns in real life. Still, you get the feeling that something is going on beyond reality. What is that? Okay, this movie is kind of slamming horror and social drama together. Not like Get Out, but it's like we're combining an Ingmar Bergman movie with a David Cronenberg movie. And the result is interesting. I mean, this is surely one of the things that defines the film, right? This collision. In most horror movies, characters either accept the supernatural almost immediately, it's just built into the world of the film, perhaps, or they deny it until about 2 seconds before it eats them, right? This movie gives us something very different, a different way to look at the possibility of something beyond reality intersecting with good old reality, the place we live. It's a much more interesting look at what it might be like if something supernatural actually started to intercede in your life. Mark tries to cling to reality for a long time in this movie. And you might want to say, dude, didn't you see the title of the film, right? Shouldn't you know that something is up? This on its own, I don't think is a huge virtue of this movie. Like, oh, it's a realistic supernatural film. Like, that's not really what I'm saying. But there's something in the richness of this question of what it means for this some other thing to be interceding into your life that makes for maybe an interesting metaphor about something else. Okay. I've been saying that big parts of this movie are defined by a complex relationship between this unyielding reality, the place we live, and a shattering occultism. But why? I mean, what is that, right? Is the point just that, hey, this is what it would be like if ghosts are real? Like I said, I don't think so, right? Is this supernatural stuff a big metaphor for something? Maybe. It could be that, this really just is. This is what divorce feels like, right? It feels like reality has fallen apart. I think there's more to this movie than that. But it's not an easy question to answer. What is this thing, right? They're making a big fuss about this, but about what, right? We never really learn the literal properties of the occult stuff in this movie. And you're really on your own when you're thinking about what it could mean beyond the film. And I don't want to, create like this big mystery, like, oh, to get the movie, you must know what this means or what it represents. Don't think so. You know what I mean? Might not mean anything, right? But let's think about it. In Film Studies 101, you're often taught that horror movies are indicating towards some big social anxieties, right? Godzilla is about nuclear energy. King Kong is about racial integration or something like that. sometimes this is a good way to read a movie, sometimes not so much. You can decide for yourself about those two examples I mentioned. In this film, it isn't totally obvious where all the fear and anxiety comes from. There's a lot of fear and anxiety, but where does it come from? Could be separation anxiety, either from a personal relationship or on a national level. I think some people read this movie like Tarkovsky's nostalgia, and talk about how Zulawski is in anguish over leaving Poland. I don't know, maybe. The Berlin Wall does feature prominently, but this reading, it doesn't quite do it for me. I do think the Soviet Union is important here, undoubtedly. What about the theological stuff, right? The talk about God, or the story of these two sisters, faith and chance. Should we be deciphering all of this stuff? Does this give us some clue about, what there is to fear out there? Maybe, but I think those ideas might be more significant at a higher level, not because of the details themselves, not because of the ideas themselves, but just because of the nature of the ideas. And this is where I come back to On the Silver Globe in some way, and this is where I get to the big thing that I've been thinking about ever since I watched this movie. I think one of the biggest things in this movie is idealization. Idealization? I'm going to say idealization, right? Kind of a vague term, but I guess it's this intellectual property or process of creating and trying to uphold some ideal. Not just thinking about it, but fighting for this ideal, right? In their own ways, Mark and Anna are both looking for an ideal partner, a more ideal partner. The ontology is a little sketchy here, but I think that's a fair claim, right? You might think that idealization would be a really positive process, thinking about all the good stuff, thinking about what you want, trying to manifest, light and angelic things. But sometimes it's an embattled process. Actually, maybe most of the time. Think about the scene with the ballerina. Okay. At first, it's not clear why the scene is in the movie at all. It's a stylistic left turn with Anna addressing the camera directly. The ontology of this scene is a bit confusing. Who filmed it, right? Of course, Zulawski uses found footage a lot on the Silver Globe. He likes this visceral personal plea to the camera, and we see it here. But again, what's going on? Why is the ballerina here? Well, there is some discussion here about the sisters or about whatever. You could try to sift through that. But I think there's something a little bit simpler, which is just that a ballerina is almost a classic example of a certain ideal of strength and beauty, a certain Soviet ideal, by the way, of strength and beauty. Strength and beauty sounds good, right? But the cultivation of it is a dark thing. And Anna, in this case, is pushing her student, Anna, is that what she's called in the movie? I forget. Anyway, is cruel to her student, is pushing her over the edge. But it's interesting that she also says, this is what I would have wanted. This is what I needed. This is what I wished, right? Crazy how this, idealism can be so painful. Interesting how this attachment to something up there can be so, uncontrollable. When you watch On the Silver Globe, talking about trying to decode things, right? When you watch that movie, you could try to decode all the ideology that swirls around that movie. There's so much of it. In my video, that's kind of what I tried to do. I just tried to slog through the subtitles and be like, what does this mean? What are they saying? But as I got farther and farther away from that movie, I started to understand it in a different way, which was more just to say, wow, look how far they're going in the name of creating a government, in the name of creating a religion. There's a madness of ideas in that movie, like a sickness of ideas, where otherwise rational people go to huge lengths to pursue some pure ideal, almost like a conquistador seeking gold, right? That movie, hey man, we're just trying to set up a religion. We're just trying to come up with a new world religion. We're just trying to set up a government, right? But it's this crazy process that's maddening, right? That shows this history as just an insane thing. You know what I mean? I think we kind of have the same thing in this movie, right? With people who were once upon a time leading relatively straightforward lives, becoming totally in the grips of something else, right? Becoming totally possessed by something else, right? We also see how this kind of thing, how it bends reality, right? How it undercuts the norms and institutions of what was once the real world, how it makes Anna and Mark's once normal life impossible, how it tears apart relationships. Note also just how personal and how intimate and potentially violating this act is, right? it's easy to forget that the ideological is personal. I'm not saying this is not the personal is political, although nothing against that. But I think that's more about like political mandates intersecting with personal life. That's a little bit more of a moralistic idea, right? The personal is political. Here, ideology being intimate is a little bit more about the genesis of this stuff. People really want to become like X, Y, and Z or whatever. People really want to be good communists or something, I guess. I don't know. In this movie, it's this thing, this process is going on. It's a passionate thing, a thing of perverse love, right? In my videos on Baba Yaga and the Conformist, by the way, I talked about how those regimes, fascist regimes in that case, were strangely libidinal. Well, same thing here, right? You might think like, shouldn't like ideology and the libido be like these totally separate things? Shouldn't they have like nothing to do with each other? But no, it turns out not the case at all most of the time in real life and in this movie. Interesting. This idealization, again, it's kind of a noble project, but it's easy to get lost, to, with enormous zeal, harbor something perverse. Shouldn't ideas help us be in control? Sometimes it's the opposite. I mean, look around today, and you'll see that, right? This concept of idealization doesn't really explain some of the more precise structures in the film, and I'm not sure that Zulawski would use that term, or that anybody else would, for that matter, or that the word even means what I think it means. But I think it answers the question of where was the anxiety coming from, and it puts into words one of these unifying processes of this Soviet time, this big harrowing reform project that Zulawski had lived through, where people become deathly attached to these kinds of ideals. I don't know. Hopefully that makes sense. Obviously, there's a lot more we could talk about in this movie. It's a rich movie, and even if you don't buy into Zulawski as the ultimate auteur, even if you don't want to read into it too deeply here, I mean, look, I didn't read into this movie very deeply. I did not engage with most of the text of it in some ways, and I think maybe at some point I might come back and do that, but there's a lot to digest. Anyway, regardless of what you think of Zulawski, there's a lot here, and even if you don't want to think about possession at all, anything, you can enjoy this movie for its really visceral moments and images, and, you know, for being an engaging and fun, well, not really fun, well, for being an interesting and unique horror film. So, look, that's Possession, and man, this is a great movie. The kind of film that the moment it finished, I thought, let's go back and watch it again. Yeah, I'm not trying to recommend it exactly to everybody, but if you're into the more obscure horror films, this is clearly a stop for you to make.